Good evening, welcome to the show. I'm Steve Price, filling in for Andrew Bolt for the rest of the week. And you wouldn't know it, would you? 7 days out from Christmas, the news doesn't stop with those devastating floods in Queensland's north. Incredible pictures coming out of there. Cairns getting a year's worth of rain in just a couple of days. Look, they're going to need a lot of help from down south, but they are very tough Queenslanders up there. They're very resilient. And like clockwork, isn't it unusual that Australia so often tosses up natural disasters around this time of the year? Well, here's what's coming up on the program tonight. Some OK polling numbers, you've got to say, for the federal government, but not so good for the Prime Minister himself, who's got plenty to think about during the break, including that request from the United States for an Australian warship to see active duty in the Red Sea. The Australian's foreign editor, Greg Sheridan, will join me next to discuss that. And while the Prime Minister's got plenty on his plate over national security, fears domestically he is being challenged over going missing on Indigenous affairs post the failed Voice referendum. The outstanding advocate for the No campaign, Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, will join the program tonight as well. And my panel, Michael Kroger and Stephen Conroy, on what the cost of living pressures are likely to do in an early New Year by-election right here in Victoria. But first, as reported in The Australian today, at least two of Australia's biggest unions have called out Canberra over the mythical belief propagated by the Albanese Labor government during the last election campaign that the rush to renewables would be good for Australian workers. Now, it was always a fantasy, and the over-promising was always going to come back to bite the Labor government. You know how it went during the campaign. Whenever a senior Labor figure was, say, in the Hunter Valley or up in Gladstone or the Latrobe Valley, and they were asked about what would happen to coal miners or gas extractors, people working in power stations, what was going to happen to all those jobs with this rush to clean green energy. Now, inevitably, with the wave of a hand from the Prime Minister or his maniacal Energy Minister Chris Bowen or the Treasurer Jim Chalmers, workers were fobbed off with the line that, look, Australia's going to become a renewable energy superpower and there'll be thousands and thousands of new green jobs. Now, clearly many of these communities believed it and Labor had a famous victory, although I suspect that was more about how disliked the Morrison government had become after Abbott, Turnbull and Morrison. The mob wanted some sort of a change. Well, here we are, halfway through the term of this government, and the harsh reality is starting to bite. Now, as reported in The Australian today, and it was this comment from Australian Workers' Union boss Steve Murphy that stood out for me. Murphy said, plainly, no, he no longer believes the green jobs malarkey, and he said, quote, if we don't have the job targets to go along with the emissions targets, we are going to go into another climate culture war. Then he belled the cat, saying, quote, we were supposed to be a renewable energy superpower, but we are not making any of this. We're not making the wind towers, we're not making the solar panels, and we're not making the wind turbines. Bang, there you have it, in a nutshell. This government, with its obsession with climate change, is intending to force closure of coal mines, costing thousands of jobs, to replace them with foreign-made green energy machinery that, once erected, will require a fraction of the manpower to maintain. We just saw Caleb Bond with some graphics showing how few jobs will stay beyond construction. Stupidly, this country, which brags to the world about our abundance of sun and wind, isn't even smart enough to produce the equipment required to generate green energy. And if the unions are awake up to the glacial pace of this green dream, then the government is in for a hell of a time. And the AWU is absolutely right. We import all this material from China. The Chinese must think we are a bunch of mugs. But as far as I can remember, the renewable energy superpower line went unchallenged. That's until now. And if you weren't nervous before about late last week when people in Sydney were told, oh, well, hang on, don't put on your air conditioner, can you imagine what a high, hot summer will be like? Oh, and just a footnote. Seeing those floodwater pictures out of far north Queensland and further south, what happens to a paddock full of solar panels if we get rain like that? Just a thought. As I said, the latest Newspoll in The Australian shows support for Labor has rebounded. still maintaining its lead, two-party preferred over the coalition. That's the Newspoll. But in a different poll in the Financial Review, the Freshwater Strategy poll, it's a bit of a different story. Labor's lost its lead for the first time since the election. The Prime Minister's personal ratings also continue to slide. Now, clearly, it has been a shocking second half of the year for the PM. The video referendum was a debacle he's struggling to recover from. He divided the country, with 60% of Australians voting no. He denies it, but he's not been strong in his support of Israel, and no senior minister of his government has even been there. Electricity prices are a broken promise, but it's the cost of living that's killing Anthony Albanese politically. Costing a fortune nowadays to fill up your car with petrol. Mortgage stress is real, given the interest rate rises. So let's bring in the foreign editor at the Australian newspaper, Greg Sheridan. Greg, always great to see you. What do you make of how Anthony Albanese is doing mid-term? He's 18 months into a 3-year term.
Well, I think Albanese is a terrifically good bloke, and most people recognise that. I mean, he's a good-hearted individual and he wants the best for Australia. But his government has run badly off the rails, and they need to take this Christmas period to reset and gather themselves again. They've lost all sense of direction on strategic issues. We just give junk and phony rubbish to Ukraine. He's had no discipline on Israel at all, absolutely no discipline. And now we're even humming and hawing about sending one lousy ship to help the Americans in the Red Sea, whereas the whole basis of AUKUS is that they'll send their ships to help us. The energy stuff, everything you said is absolutely true. And just to add another piquant note to that, China makes all this stuff cheap because they use coal-generated electricity. They have such a big price advantage because they get cheap electricity, which they make with the coal that we export to them. And then we re-import all this stuff and pay a massive premium on it. I think the government looks as though it doesn't care about the ordinary concerns of regular folks. It was massively derailed by the voice referendum, and it looked as though it was obsessed with sort of bespoke, issues that count for the elites but don't count for ordinary folks. And in the end, it's going to come down to the economy and security as ever. And it's tracking, having started out really well, it's tracking poorly on both those fronts.
Greg, this might be a bit harsh, but is he perhaps a bit weak on foreign affairs? That's your area of expertise.
Yes, I think he started out well, but his government has just become completely confused. And again, I think the voice referendum has a large amount to do with it because it's lost all sense of its own strategic judgment. I think they've fundamentally misjudged China. So whether it's DFAT or the Labor Party itself, they've decided they don't need to make any military preparations because of China at all, and that they can just manage China diplomatically. As a result, now they've gone silent on China, whereas they used to speak out loudly about it, and they've done nothing on defence at all. They've been weak on Ukraine and appallingly weak on Israel. I mean, you have to make a choice. If Hamas is at war with Israel, are you in favour of the liberal democracy or are you in favour of the terrorist death cult? And certainly Albanese and his ministers denounce Hamas. They do that. But they've had no cabinet discipline on this, and they've been at odds with America and Britain and with Israel itself on this. They're trying to talk out of both sides of their mouth at the same time. And I supported all the Prime Minister's individual trips, but all of that happy, clappy travel stuff, and, Miles is even worse than Albanese on it. He travels all the time but never delivers anything in defence. That's not a substitute for a real policy. Their only policy in defence is to blather on about AUKUS, for which they're not going to do anything for 10 years. And in the end, you've got to, it's where's the beef, Jack? The electorate never turns out a first-term government, but they are in, a fair amount of mid-term pain, I think.
Is there any defence to not one senior minister visiting Israel? I know Penny Wong's going to go there in January, but I don't quite understand why she's got to wait for Christmas and New Year. But that aside, is there any defence that no one's been there?
No, it's kind of pathetic, really. We make these fabulously emotional speeches about how we stand with Israel forever, and then we criticise them when they try to defend themselves, and we take no serious action of solidarity with them whatsoever. So all sorts of social democratic and centre-left leaders went to express solidarity with Israel after the most barbaric terrorist attacks we've witnessed in the modern era. Now, presumably Penny Wong, for whom I have a great deal of respect, wants to go there as late as possible in the hope that the fighting will be over by then. But, you know, you can't have it both ways. You can't stand side by side with the Islamist demonstrators in southwestern Sydney and stand side by side with Israel at the same time. You can't say, as the Prime Minister does, Hamas must be dismantled and must never again have any role in the future of Gaza, and then say to the Israelis, but you cannot take any military action to achieve that end. You cannot say we stand with Israel four square and then support a motion in the United Nations which condemns Israel, demands a ceasefire and says nothing about Hamas, and then not even send, you know, in a government which travels more often, you know, if I had their frequent flyer points, I'd resign from the paper and just spend my life on a luxury cruise. And yet they can't find it in them to have one senior minister spend one day in Israel to say, you know what, this is the only Jewish state in the world. It's a liberal democracy. It's our friend. It's our ally for many decades, and we stand with you. They won't do that because they're scared the Greens will challenge them in their inner city electorates, and they're scared Muslims might turn against them in southwestern Sydney. And you can't run a government in this reactive mode, just trying to appease one group after the other. You've got to take a choice. You know, government means making choices. And if you say yes to one thing, that means saying no to something else. And all right across the policy spectrum, you know, they're trying to say yes to everybody, and therefore they're delivering nothing.
We saw some very disturbing pictures out of southern Gaza today, where you have got these truckloads of relief that are getting through. There's not much of it getting through, but some are. But to see the crowds that then descended, and we're looking at those pictures now, descended on these vehicles, that is a horrible thing to witness. And, you know, that's not Hamas propaganda there. That's news footage from Sky UK. But that's just horrendous to witness, Greg. Look at that.
Look, it sure is, Steve. Yeah, it sure is. And being concerned about the suffering of innocent civilians in Gaza is not being anti-Israel or anti-Semitic or anything else. The moral responsibility for all of that rests on Hamas. Hamas has built 500 kilometres of tunnels under Gaza. Can you imagine how much concrete and how much money was diverted from the people of Gaza to do that? Now, I think Israel will, in the next few weeks, have to change its operations in order to allow more humanitarian supplies to get through. And, of course, some of that will be stolen by Hamas, there's no doubt. But nonetheless, it's going to have to pay that price. And that will mean probably more Israeli soldiers killed, but it will mean more Gazan civilians surviving. Israel is going to have to do that. All war is terrible and bloody. Hamas wanted this to happen. They attacked Israel in the most provocative way that they possibly could in order to produce suffering amongst their own people, in order to make the world turn against Israel. Now, you and I, Steve, can work that out. And, you know, you're a man of great intelligence. I'm a bear of little brain. You'd think the Albanese government would just about be able to work it out too.
You would. Always great to catch up. Thank you very much, Greg Sheridan there from The Australian. Now, coming up, the voice referendum was the only thing the Prime Minister wanted to talk about in the middle of the year, since on Indigenous issues, nothing, zero. And Alice Springs-based Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price has called him out. She is going to join the program next. And I listed earlier some of the Labor government's biggest failings this year, perhaps none more divisive than the Prime Minister's failed referendum, unable to convince 60% of Australians to vote for a voice to Parliament. I had the government's undivided attention for months, and we'll talk to Jacinta Price next. Welcome back. Steve Price in for Andrew Bolt. Now, I mentioned the Prime Minister's failed referendum. We all know now that 60% of Australians voted no to a change to our Constitution. Now, it had the government's undivided attention for months. It was the only thing we ever heard about. The Prime Minister was either on a plane travelling overseas or he was on television talking about the voice. He failed to address all the other important issues like electricity and the cost of living that's now coming back to bite him. But in the Prime Minister's very cute and well-produced end-of-year recap video, it's a topic he seemed to have glossed over.
2023, the Matildas inspired a nation. Australians dominated Hollywood. Vegemite turned 100. It's been a big year. And even in the tough times, we saw the best of Australia. Families are feeling pressure. As a government, our main focus has been on delivering cost of living relief while taking pressure off inflation. We helped up to 5 million households and small businesses with rebates on their energy bills. Real wages have increased for the last 2 quarters. We've had nearly 300,000 enrolments in fee-free TAFE this year alone, with more to come. We've made a historic investment in Medicare, tripling the bulk billing incentive to make it easier and cheaper to see a doctor.
What a crock. I mean, don't you hate those staged pieces like that with actors pretending to be families outside of an IGA? I mean, it really drives me nuts. Shadow Indigenous Australians Minister Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, she's accused the Prime Minister of being, quote, missing in action since the defeat with no plan to address disadvantage. I'm pleased to say the Senator's on the line. What did you make of the video, Jacinta?
Look, it's this Prime Minister's fantasy. Looking back on the year, he failed at the beginning of last year to effectively address the issues of crime that are going on the streets of Alice Springs. He came here, he threw a bit of money at the problem, he left, and really nothing much has changed. There's still incidents of crime occurring on our streets. I had a friend who was rammed by a stolen vehicle. Nothing much has changed. Obviously, the Prime Minister completely forgot that there was a referendum that was held right throughout the year. I certainly haven't forgotten because I think it's been one of the most busiest years of my entire life. But he clearly, just like throughout the campaign, once again is gaslighting Australians to pretend as though it didn't even occur in the first place.
Isn't it interesting when you look at it this way? It shows that we went through months and months and months of divisive debate, dividing the nation around this question. It lost as we predicted it would, and nothing's changed. So if it had gotten up, probably nothing would have changed either in the areas that you so brilliantly prosecuted during the campaign.
That's exactly right. I mean, the fact that the government spent over $400 million on this, not to mention the donations that were made to the Yes campaign, well, do we know if they've been expended? Where is the money now? What has it been? Was it all expended on the entire campaign? Was it not? The calls from the Australian people as a result of this to actually hold inquiry into organisations that are funded to improve the lives of our most disadvantaged. And still this government is failing to heed those calls. But clearly the result, 60-40 result that the Australian people delivered, as well as those messages, has indicated to the Prime Minister what he needs to do. He didn't have a backup plan. There was never a plan B because they were determined they were going to win this referendum. And now they're scrambling for ways forward, for a plan of some sort. They cannot put anything into action. They don't have anything.
Is one Indigenous kid in Alice Springs better off because of the voice process?
No, there isn't. I mean, as I said, the situation hasn't changed much at all. We've been calling for a Royal Commission into the sexual abuse of Indigenous children. We know the evidence is stark that demonstrates that our kids, the most marginalised kids in this country, also experience the highest rates of sexual abuse in this country, and yet this government continues to ignore the calls for this to take place over and over again. And no, the situation hasn't improved on the ground. Once more, those kids that stole the vehicle, that rammed a good friend of mine with it, ending up in hospital with that incident. Some of them were as young as 12. Nothing's changed on the ground.
Just finally, when you talk to parents of some of those children who are trying to do their best to bring them up, how let down do they feel by the fact that the man who's the Prime Minister of their country could jet in there for a couple of hours, do basically nothing and fly out again, and then the rest of the country, the media and everybody just goes, oh, well, maybe it never happened, we'll move on?
Look, there are many in the community that are beside themselves. There are elders in this community that have plans to support these vulnerable children. The Yipperinya school, the elders of that school, they've had a proposal sitting in front of the Minister Burney, as well as the Education Minister Clare, as well as obviously the Prime Minister, and still they're not listening to community members. The voice was about listening. I don't know how many times I've heard this Prime Minister say, when you listen to Indigenous Australians and work with them, well, there's groups of Indigenous people right around the country that they have been flat out ignoring and continuing to ignore because they didn't get their referendum up.
He should be ashamed when he sees some of those pictures. Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, have a great Christmas. Thanks for joining us tonight on Sky. What a fabulous job she did right through that campaign. Just want to go back to foreign affairs now. The US has asked us, as we know, to send a warship into the Red Sea to protect merchant vessels. Now, this is from those Houthi rebels who are attacking merchant shipping that's going through there. It's a request the federal government is still considering. Now, given the request is from our biggest ally, you wonder why the delay? And as I said on Friday, we need all the good friends we can get, given the region we're in. It comes as we've seen recent tensions with those rebels in the Red Sea, and the US Navy apparently now has shot down multiple drones on those commercial shipping lanes. Strategic Analysis Australia Director Michael Shoebridge joins us. Why do you think the government's being so slack in agreeing or not agreeing to provide this ship? Can we not at least get an answer?
Well, Steve, one reason is that we've got a very small, ageing Navy, and under the Albanese government and the current Defence Department leadership, Australia won't get a single new warship for 10 years until 2033. So the cupboard's pretty bare. The other reason, apparently, is that the government hadn't had a National Security Committee of Cabinet meeting scheduled, and you'd think that was an easy problem for them to solve. But, the vessels we do have, we've got those 3 air warfare destroyers. They're powerful vessels, but they're about to go into a major refit program. And our 8 Anzac frigates are getting very old. And neither of these classes of ship is really well equipped to deal with armed drones. So on a practical level, we don't have enough ships. There's problems with crews for them. And they're not optimised to deal with the weapons the Houthis have.
God forbid we ever have to defend ourselves.
Well, you're quite right. I mean, isn't it extraordinary for me to be sitting here saying with a defence budget of $52.6 billion this financial year, our Navy can't send a ship to help secure this key international sea lane because they're not equipped to handle armed drones. So, the anti-ship missiles they have are extremely good, but it's about $1 million a missile to shoot down a $1,000 drone, and you don't have many missiles in the ships.
That just seems extraordinary. What is the purpose of these Houthi rebels attacking those commercial ships in the Red Sea? What are they attempting to do?
Well, the Houthis, as you said at the start, Steve, are backed by Iran. So the cruise missiles and the armed drones that they're attacking the ships with, and they've also tried to attack Israel with, are supplied by Iran. Like Hamas, the Houthis are Iranian proxies. So Hamas's equipment, whether it's their improvised explosive devices, their rockets, or their drones, they're Iranian supplied too. The Houthis are doing what Hamas hoped Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the other Iranian proxy, and the Houthis were all going to do, which is come out in support of Hamas after its murderous attacks. And only the Houthis have done that, and they're threatening the shipping lane.
I want to turn our attention to another matter of national security. The government, it looks like, is not going to stop Abdel Ben Brika, the bloke who, who threatened to blow up the MCG on grand final day, was going to attack the nuclear plant in Sydney and other targets, because he believes he doesn't pose a significant enough risk. Do we wear that excuse?
No, I think this, I'm saying that under this government where the Navy's not getting another warship for 10 years, well, this area of home affairs under the current government is another slow motion car crash. The problems we've seen with immigration detention and now with detention of convicted terrorists were hidden in plain sight. They were obvious that the government was going to face these challenges, and quick as a flash, they did nothing about it. The problem with convicted Islamist terrorists is there's no evidence globally that you can de-radicalise them in prison. In fact, the only evidence we have is that when they come out, they can recommit violent terrorist offences, like that murderous knife attack in the middle of London a few years ago. So the government knows this, and it just watched this problem emerge, and they had no answer. Now they're trying to make the best of it.
Yeah, they need to get on the front foot about a few of these things. Michael Shoebridge, thank you as usual for your time. I want to turn our attention now to the issue in Queensland. Let's check on the latest from the flood-ravaged north and far north. The amount of water dumped on Cairns amounts to a year's worth of rain in around 40 hours. Authorities have confirmed a number of evacuations are underway in what's been labelled the worst floods there since 1977. All sorts of rivers, the Daintree, the Herbert, the Barron, they're all very swollen. One man was found clinging to a tree as croc-infested floodwaters flowed around him. It was just extraordinary vision. He had spent the night in that tree, was eventually rescued by local Gavin Deere in his boat. The ADF have got choppers there supporting personnel. They've been deployed to the region as the flooding eases at the Cairns airport. The PM's announced immediate funding to residents and local councils in the area. Take a look.
Defence Force, it's not just the people around Cairns City. It's gone to, of course, the Tablelands and south to Tully and up into Cape York as well. And, of course, many of those communities will be very difficult to get to, which is why the ADF assets will be important in reaching those people and those communities.
That's the PM, and in the past few hours, the new Queensland Premier Stephen Miles has spoken in an address paying tribute to Queenslanders who have stepped in, that's average, normal community folk, during their moment of need.
I want to thank our first responders for their incredible work, but also those good Samaritans, those Queenslanders lending a hand, mate for mate, including we've had reports of people using mustering, choppers and fishing boats to rescue strangers or people they know around town. Everyone's working incredibly hard.
But enough of the politicians from down south. Joining me live is Cairns Mayor Terry James. Terry, how are you getting on, my friend?
Oh, good, Steve. The rain has finally stopped today, and tomorrow we'll be able to get in there and assess the damage, because at the moment we don't know what we don't know.
Just clear up something that I've been concerned about during the day, and you may not know the answer to this. The extent of the rain, was that forecast by the Bureau of Meteorology? Did they? I know they were concentrating on Tropical Cyclone Jasper, but did they tell anyone in Queensland that they were going to get hit by this much rain?
Steve, I think everyone was caught by surprise. The rain was supposed to go across the peninsula and into the Cape, but what happened? It just got over land and stopped still, and just kept raining and raining, and no one predicted that, and we ended up with double the amount of rain that was predicted.
At the peak of it, when it was just raining, flat out, what did it sound like, and could you believe what you were seeing?
No, Steve, I'm born in Cairns and I've never seen anything like it. It just kept coming and coming and coming, and then the phone started, and we knew what we were in for. It was just horrendous. It was intense rain, never seen before.
Places like Holloway Beach, I saw a reporter from the Cairns Post. He'd been out there, and sadly, a woman mopping out her house, full of mud, just before Christmas. I mean, Terry, couldn't have happened. And it's no good time for something like this to happen, but it's really a bad time right now because you've now got to deal as a community with the damage, and you're in the middle of the Christmas tourism season, and I presume a lot of people are cancelling.
Absolutely, they are, and that's the message, Steve. We practice for this, not as much rain as this. We are a resilient community, and we'd ask people, once we get through this, please book again. There's a lot of small businesses in this area that would love to see you. They need the patronage, and we'll be here with open arms. What
about the economic impact? I mean, you're such a food bowl for Australia: sugarcane, fruit crops, pineapples, or livestock as well. How bad is that going to be, do you think?
Yes, it'll take us a while. I don't think there was a business or an industry that hasn't been affected with this rain. So, it will be a little bit of a while. And the other biggest issue, I suppose, with all of this rain, we were running out of water this morning. Would you believe it? Because the the water intake
shouldn't laugh.
Was blocked. And we thought that we'd be running out at 10 o'clock this morning, but luckily our people got in there very early and unblocked that. And the first people we put back online, of course, was the hospital.
How much help do you need from down south?
We've got a lot of help. That's been exceptional. We've got a lot of SES crews. We've had a lot of help from the ADF. It's been exceptional, and we've got more people coming in tomorrow. So those people that have had water through their homes, we will have the rural firefighting services, the SES to help clean those homes out and hose them out.
Further up, just finally, Terry, the reports of crocodiles in the water. I mean, for all us softies down south, we think of that and we have a nightmare. That must be a terribly dangerous thing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we've heard a couple of reports of crocodiles. That's the extent of the water. It rose that much, it released them from some of their ponds. So that's, I heard one from Hartley's Creek got out. So absolutely, you think it's a joke, but it's not. So, and a lot of cattle. There's a lot of cattle being arrested from the rivers as well.
Terry James, Cairns Mayor, good luck with it all. I hope you get on well. I know the Queenslanders are tough people. If anybody can survive it, you can. So thank you very much, and keep up the good work, and we'll try and talk to you again later in the week. Now, I'll unpack the crisis at Radio National Breakfast on the ABC. Morning radio apparently is in some sort of meltdown. I do know a little bit about radio. And the flight over net zero targets are causing Labor a major rift. Plus, grocery bills have shoppers bracing for even more financial turmoil. Welcome back now. ABC Radio National's flagship news program, Radio National Breakfast. We read today in the Australian newspaper, story by Sophie Ellsworth, that they're in some sort of crisis. Now, they had long-time host Fran Kelly. She stepped down 2 years ago, and when she went, so did about a third of the audience. A staggering 34% drop in just 24 months in ratings. Now, in the last financial year, as we know, the ABC got more than $1 billion in 2023-24. The government will hand out $1.08 billion, and in 24-25, the ABC gets a rise, $1.1 billion. A lot of money for a left-leaning broadcaster that really doesn't represent all Australians at all. Let's bring in my panel tonight. Former Victorian Liberal President and ABC board member Michael Kroger and former Labor Senator Stephen Conroy. Great to have you on board.
Steve.
Now, Michael, you were on the board of the ABC. Why did you torture yourself by doing that?
Well, because I was asked to do it, but you can fix the ABC if you have a board committed to doing it. Unfortunately, even though the Howard government appointed most of the board members, there wasn't a lot of will to fight. And unless you fight the management, you end up with the ABC as is today, which is a disaster.
Stephen Conroy, I must admit, I don't think I have listened to Radio National Breakfast at all or very often. That's more likely to be a program you'd be tuning into. Is there a problem with the current host?
Well, look, I was a huge fan of Fran, so I confess I haven't listened to it a lot since I left politics. I don't need to plug myself in quite the same way that I did previously, so I don't think I've dumped listening to it because of the change in producer. I just don't listen to quite as much political news first thing in the morning. Often I'm out cycling, trying to keep myself in some sort of shape. And so I tend to miss Radio National. So I guess that's a reflection of my priorities rather than the show. I mean, what I've been disappointed about the ABC over the last 10 years or so is it's lost its focus on its news and its quality of its news. And so I think the board over the last 10 years has allowed it to be distracted.
Can we tell our friend Mr Conroy you can put earbuds in and at the
Listen,
same time?
This is what we've got to say about the ABC. It's no longer trusted. I mean, no Liberal voter in this country, apart from a very small group, trusts the ABC. And trust in the national broadcaster has plummeted in recent years. You can't trust them on The Voice. You can't trust them on asylum seekers. You can't trust them on anything they say about Dutton or Morrison. They didn't like Howard. They never liked a Conservative Liberal leader. They didn't like Tony Abbott, because they loved Malcolm. Liberal voters, National Party voters, do not trust news and current affairs coming out of Sydney. Country ABC radio, different. Yep. But what's coming out of Sydney, this is not the most trusted media organisation. Far from it.
It should be.
Well, it's sad for $1 billion. Plus, I think there's some transmission costs on top of that, by the way. It's another 100 odd million. But the national broadcaster likes to say we're the most trusted organisation. That is clearly bunkum these days, unfortunately, Steve.
Well, Stephen, I mean, that is a problem. I mean, you know, you and I are old enough and ugly enough to remember when the ABC, particularly ABC Melbourne, was a high-rating radio station. They've lost huge numbers from the local Melbourne ABC, and they make strange decisions. I mean, the two shows, breakfast shows in Sydney and Melbourne on local radio are hosted by comedians.
No, look, I think the incessant attacks by the Liberal Party and you know, Michael would be at front and centre and proud to be front and centre of those campaigns have actually meant that the you know, they've had these editorial guidelines. You can't have an opinion, you can't express an opinion. So they try and hide behind comedians who can say, oh, we were just joking, rather than actually attempting to present and analyse news. So I think the amount of news and the shows that are being reduced, even the drum, and let me assure you, I am a massive critic of the drum. I mean, I disagree with Michael on the basis that the left wing of the Liberal Party run the ABC, along with the Greens. It's not a pro-Labor organisation. And when they announced they were cancelling the drum, I texted a friend of mine who works there and said, how will the left wing of the Liberal Party in New South Wales talk to each other if they can't go on the drum?
Yeah, it's a bit rich. Now, Michael, I mentioned at the start of the program, it seems that the union movement, the AWU, have suddenly worked out that there's not going to be a lot of jobs out of this new green energy projects, where we import everything from you know, the blades to the wind towers to the solar panels. And so the AWU have now gone, well, hang on, where are our jobs going to be?
Yeah, well, there's a fascinating article in The Australian this morning, if people haven't read it. Keith Pitt, the National Party MP, did a survey of the 8 biggest new projects. $24 billion for these 8 projects. 170 permanent jobs. 170. So Chris Bowen's saying there are 600,000 jobs in the renewable sector. I mean, I hope Chris is right, but he's been wrong about almost everything during his career. Let's get Chris come on the show and give us a list of where those 600,000 jobs are coming from. This seems to be fanciful, and the AWU a little bit slow, but they seem to be waking up to this, Steve.
Stephen Conroy, that is obviously going to be a concern for the Albanese Labor government if the unions are going to turn on them on the lack of jobs.
No, but to be fair, I think that's been an issue for a number of years. And I've heard Albanese talk about wanting to be a producer of, some of these renewable sectors, particularly some of the components in the renewable sectors. He's talked about wanting to be a battery manufacturer here in Australia. So I think the government have said the right things, but where I think you're seeing is as their policies are driving more and more projects to get onto the building phase, the criticism that, all of this is taking place offshore. I mean, I think there's one solar panel manufacturer in Australia at the moment. I mean, this is our technology. Australia developed this technology. We should be exploiting it. We are a natural place for there to be, solar.
Well, why is the government not getting on and doing it
in
then?
The world. No, well, I think it's a fair criticism of the unions to say, OK, we've got all these projects on the go, we're behind you on the renewable target, now let's start seeing some actual production in Australia. It's one of the reasons the National Reconstruction Fund's been set up. It's always hard to push
in office for 18 months. We can't even make a windmill.
Yeah, let's be clear, Steve. The world doesn't work that simply in terms of legislation passing Parliament to establish these funds. I wish it did. I myself went through, a couple of years trying to drive, and I was, solely focused on driving the rollout of the National Broadband Network, which did create and still creates jobs on a massive scale in Australia. But it actually takes, whether it's bureaucratic resistance, whether it's legislative slowdown, there's a whole variety of factors, and it takes focus and determination. And I think the government should take heed of what the unions are saying to start driving this agenda. I know Ed Husick will be on this. He's been championing these sorts of issues for years.
Michael, I note Woolworths have done a survey of their customers. 40% of their customers predict their families are going to be worse off financially next year. That's a real worry for the government, but it's more of a worry for the poor people who can't afford to buy groceries.
It's terrible. It's terrible, and I think things are going to get worse next year because people cannot afford. If you look at household savings ratio, it's plummeted. All the money they stacked away during the pandemic, gone. At the core of Albanese's problem, by the way, people haven't worked this out yet, at the core of Albanese's loss of support is the fact that before the election, he said to people, the subliminal message was, life is meant to be easy. He twisted Malcolm's word. He said, life is meant to be easy. It's Morrison and Frydenberg and those Liberals, cost of living crisis. Jim Chalmers and I will fix all of this. He led people to believe that it would be easy to fix cost of living issues, and now people have worked out they were lied to, Steve.
They were lied to. Michael Kroger and Stephen Conroy, thank you very much for your time. Now, we will be back after the break. ABC unions and Anthony Albanese are pushing Labor for more climate targets, so we've dealt with that. We are going to cross to the UK to get the latest from British politics, as the UK Labor leader's legal history over there has raised some eyebrows, and the controversial Rwanda plan, where they're going to fly all of these boat people off to Rwanda, has hit some turbulence, and there's more on the royal phone hacking, and a royal phone hacking scandal has been exposed. I'll be dissecting the biggest stories shaping Britain with Esther Kraku next. Welcome back. Steve Price in for Andrew Bolt. Keep a watch on Sky. We'll have updates on the flood situation in North Queensland. Let's go to the UK now, though, where British politics is in a bit of uproar today over the opposition leader Sir Keir Starmer's past legal work. It was revealed the UK Labor leader acted on behalf of an extremist Islamist group trying to overturn a ban imposed by Germany back in 2008. And the controversial Rwanda asylum plan looks like it's been grounded yet again amidst airline refusals to fly these people and a major phone hacking scandal. We know about that. Prince Harry could potentially expose an even wider media misconduct trial. Let's go live to the UK to get the latest from writer and commentator Esther Kraku. Great to see you again. Is Keir Starmer, is that a problem for him?
Well, yes, it's a massive problem for him because it's just reminding the public who exactly Keir Starmer is. I mean, this was someone who was the head of the Crown Prosecution Service that actually didn't prosecute the likes of Jimmy Savile. And now you have these little revelations of his past legal work and where his true political leanings were, coming out of the woodwork. The fact that he led a team of lawyers to petition the European Court of Human Rights to actually allow an Islamist group banned in Germany for saying things like death to all Jews wherever they are found is quite telling. Look, at the end of the day, he has held a certain line with this Israel-Gaza conflict, but it's very clear from a lot of his work in the past, his alignment with Jeremy Corbyn, who we know was ousted from the Labour Party because of his tolerance of rampant anti-Semitism in the party, that actually he's probably more aligned with the extreme left in the party that has sympathies for these kinds of groups than where most of the country is. And this is a continual reminder. It's very hard for him to effectively excuse this away, because people are going to think, actually, what are your true political views? Up until now, we don't know anything. I think the only kind of reason why Labour are completely crushing the Tories in the polls is just because the Tories have done such a terrible job of making their case. I don't think it's because of enthusiasm for the Labour Party, and much less Keir Starmer.
One of the other problems, Esther, of course, that the Conservatives have got is they can't protect the British borders. Now, you've got this Rwanda plan. It looks like it's going to have even more challenges. You've got airlines, as we understand it, refusing to actually provide planes due to reputation fears. I mean, is that Rwanda plan ever going to get off the ground?
Well, it will be a Christmas miracle, or a New Year miracle, should I say, if it ever actually happens. But we knew that commercial airlines were always reluctant to allow refugees to board their planes to Kigali in Rwanda. We knew this from the outset of the scheme, and it looks like they're doubling down. I think the issue is that the only option that the Prime Minister has now is to use planes that belong to the Ministry of Defence, and they would have to leave from an airstrip in Wiltshire. And then you have the logistical problem there of actually having to provide security because it's likely to be flooded with protesters. Estimates now are saying that it will cost up to £20 million in security to ring-fence the area just to keep or to cordon off the area so that protesters don't get in and disrupt the flight. So, we knew that the Rwanda scheme was going to be faced with all sorts of legal and logistical problems. The question is, can it actually happen? I think the biggest scandal will be if it's blocked by the Lords or the courts, because then that's actually a constitutional and fundamental problem in the UK, which is who actually runs this country. Is Parliament sovereign, or are unelected people in the House of Lords sovereign, or the courts? And, this is something that we haven't actually had to discuss up until now.
Prince Harry's had a win, $267,000, which is not a lot of money, but he's had a win.
He has had a win, yes. So the judge ruled that 15 out of the 33 stories that he was alleging, information was obtained via phone hacking was actually true. So if this could set a precedent for actually blowing the doors open of effectively a culture of unlawful information gathering in British media, particularly between the years of 2007 to 2013, which is what the judge says. Yeah. This was at least at the peak of that situation.
Well, I'm sure he's happy to have some sort of a win. Esther Krakow, it's always great to catch up with you. Thank you for joining us on the show. I'll be back tomorrow night. Coming up next, we've got Chris Kenny, and Chris will have updates for you, of course, on that situation in Queensland with the floods.